Exactly 8 years to the day of Emmett Till's death. On a hot August afternoon in the nation's capital, the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. delivered one of the great calls to action in human history. The March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom was perhaps the pinnacle of the civil rights movement. But only men spoke. Mark Strassmann now on the women who helped to plan it.
Destiny demands struggle. On August 28, 1963, many in the crowd filing into Washington, D.C. had been scoffed at, spit at, shot at. Their country still owed a promissory note to Black Americans.
Standing before the Lincoln Memorial on the 28th of August,
A. Philip Randolph, the dean of the Civil Rights Movement, conceived the March on Washington. He belonged to a group of civil rights leaders, all men, known as the Big Six.
You had John Lewis in his 20s, Martin King in his 30s, Whitney Young in his late 30s, early 40s.
Mark Morial is president of the National Urban League.
Now, King was the star of the show.
Dr. Martin Luther King,
The great orator, the best known of the civil rights leadership, but he himself would even say at the time that this is a joint undertaking.
Dr. King's speech for the ages summoned generations of injustice.
because I have a dream. My 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
But on that momentous day, another group was denied the spotlight. They were the unsung heroes of the March on Washington. Leaders, visionaries, organizers, and ordinary foot soldiers. This was a march for equality, and they were its second-class citizens.
Oftentimes for African Americans, the men had titles, but the women did a lot of the real work.
Derek Johnson, the president of the NAACP. And it's pretty remarkable what they pulled off when you look back on it, isn't it?
It was both strategic, fascinating, diverse. We oftentimes talk about the Big Six. Those were the 6 major organizations when we really should be talking about the Big 7. Because Dorothy Height, National Council of Negro Women, played a key role in pulling together that march.
Dorothy Height spearheaded modern political organization. She was also known as the godmother of the civil rights movement. Present for many major marches and milestones over 60 years, she recognized that racism and sexism were part of the same fight.
I think there are so many things that women did that not only supported but were active elements in the success of the civil rights movement.
Rosa Parks was also there. She had refused to give up her bus seat and launched the movement. And Anna Hedgeman, another march organizer. She later co-founded the National Organization for Women.
The March on Washington will involve hundreds of thousands of Americans on August the 28th.
Without Facebook or Twitter, thousands of women volunteers made history happen. 250,000 people rallied on the Washington Mall.
By today's standards, what we had to do to organize the march surely seems primitive.
In 1963, Eleanor Holmes Norton was a 26-year-old law school student and a march volunteer.
Part of my task was to help them get buses and trains, but particularly buses, and to hook them up with other groups that were coming in buses to Washington from what I must tell you was all over the United States.
12 men addressed the crowd, which created backstage drama. Not one woman was allowed to be a featured speaker.
But we thought that a woman saying something on behalf of women would have been an additional part of the march.
The men in charge argued picking one woman speaker would make the others jealous. Anna Hedgeman was furious. The Big Six then agreed one woman could make a public pledge of loyalty.
Miss Daisy Bates.
A. Philip Randolph introduced Daisy Bates. She had led the drive to desegregate Little Rock schools.
women of this country, Mr. Randolph, pledge to you, to Martin Luther King, Roy Wilkins, and all of you fighting for civil liberties, that we will join hands with you as women of this country.
Randolph then seemed confused. Which women were being recognized?
Will the Miss Rosa Parks, will they all stand?
And that was it. Dorothy Height never got closer than this to the microphone.
When it came to speakers, everybody except her spoke. It was a deliberate mistake. I think that showed us that even in the civil rights movement, with all of its talk of equality, sexism was still deeply rooted.
Sometimes even reform movements need reforming.
Chauvinism was alive and well, even in the black community.
Ten march leaders met with President Kennedy at the White House. All of them men.
Women were endemic to the organization of the movement. Their voices were not heard on that day.
Sherilyn Ifill leads the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Clearly a missed opportunity.
Oh, of course, but honestly, if I look at the period of the 1960s, we could roll out the list of missed opportunities for women to have their voices heard.
In 1964, President Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act. A year later, the Voting Rights Act became law. In the decades since, women present at the march gradually had their voices heard. Eleanor Holmes Norton built on the legacies of Hedgeman and Height.
The distinguished representative from the district.
I thank my good friend.
Congresswoman Norton has represented Washington, D.C. for almost 2 decades. Dorothy Height received the Presidential Medal of Freedom and the Congressional Gold Medal, America's 2 highest civilian awards. She died in 2010 at age 98. America's first black president eulogized her.
She too deserves a place in our history books. She too deserves a place of honor in America's memory.
The mistake that was made in not allowing Dorothy Height to speak, it left such an indelible mark on the movement that it would never again be repeated.
In 2013, the march's 50th anniversary, its women leaders were finally recognized. Sherilyn Ifill made sure of it.
I said all of their names in the 3 minutes that I had allotted to me.
Gloria Richardson, and Fannie Lou Hamer, and Rosa Parks, and Constance.
Because I wanted to make sure that I honored the women who had not been able to speak at the original March on Washington and lift up their work and their extraordinary contributions.
You know, fast forward, what we are seeing, particularly today, is we're seeing a rise of many women leaders in civil rights.
I see what is happening today as a mere continuation of what began in the 1960s. It's looking at the spots that were far more hidden.
The founders of the Black Lives Matter movement are all women. And so actually this is a moment when the voice, particularly of black women, is not only being heard, it is really commanding the stage, and it's our time.
Next, how a death in Ferguson, Missouri sparked a new movement in America, changing the way Americans talk about race and policing.